Hello, and welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. I am your host, Dana Jonson. And today, my guest is Dr. Alison Escalante, who is a board-certified pediatrician with a remarkable career spanning over 2 decades. Alison, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. I'm going to give a little intro to Dr. Escalante. She's known for her innovative approach to parenting and child development. She's dedicated the last 10 years to exploring methods that empower parents to meet their children's needs. Dr. Escalante is the author of an upcoming book, See, Start, which introduces a science-based 3-step method to overcoming the parenting should storm, which is basically a culture of criticism and anxiety that robs parents of any joy. Her work, which reflects her passion for neurodiversity and special needs, focuses on helping parents connect deeply with their children as they are, beyond the pressure of societal expectations. In our conversation today, we'll explore her approach to parenting and delve into how parents can foster a supportive and understanding environment for their children, especially those with neurodiverse traits. So we will get started with that in just a second, but as usual, I need to play my disclaimer first.
The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction.
So hello, Dr. Escalante. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. I would like to start with a background on you. What's your background? What brought you to where you are today and who you are today? And we'll go from there.
Oh, wow. That's a long story.
Well, let's abbreviate it maybe, but
yeah.
The Reader's Digest version.
The Reader's Digest version. Well, one of the things that I think before I was in medicine that is probably important is when I was in college, I had the opportunity to kind of dive into a pretty specific major. And so I did intellectual and cultural history, focusing on the Renaissance. And my minor was in something called cultural interpretation. So that's the kind of thing you can do at Princeton. And so,
oh, that's amazing.
But what it did was it just was so inspiring to watch how ideas move through cultures and change history. And that's what that was all about. And so I came into medicine with that framework.
That's a fascinating background for going into medicine, I would think. It gives you a complete perspective that's just fascinating to me. I want to go back to college now.
Oh, it was a great thing to study. And I think it did a lot of things. It allowed me to ask questions about why we did things the way we did in medicine. I did a lot of looking at the history of medicine and how did we get here? And I think that's important because those histories are often reasons why certain groups are relatively neglected or even have incorrect beliefs about them. And that's been a huge factor for the neurodiverse community.
Yes.
But it also really affected my approach to medicine. And I had a mentor even while I was in med school bring that up to me. He said, you approach the way you understand a patient differently. And I think it's because you majored in history,
Yeah.
So I always wanted to understand where things started, the factors that came together, and get to know my patients outside of just a single, hey, I'm here with this thing today. And so that's kind of where I came from when I eventually started thinking about what was going on with parenting.
That's fabulous. So yeah, I would imagine that's a very interesting way to approach medicine. It sounds to me very intuitive, like it should be that way, but you're right. It's not typically that way. And speaking of medicine, I know that you have long COVID, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I've been sick with that for 2 years. Pretty severely ill, actually.
Yeah. I don't want to get too much into the details of it, but I do want to understand, can you explain what long COVID is and what those ramifications are?
Yeah, and I think that's really important for the neurodiverse community as well, because neurodiversity is a known risk factor for developing long COVID. And
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and long COVID also will make some of the things that are hard for neurodiverse people, it'll make those symptoms harder, like concentration, executive function, sensory sensitivities. But as I explained it to someone I was talking with last week, long COVID is when you get COVID and then you don't get better. Or
okay.
Some people have a mild case of COVID and then 6 weeks later, they notice a whole bunch of symptoms. And so, most people think of it as just fatigue, as being really tired, but it's a lot more than that. And depending on how severe a case you have of it, and I have a very severe case, it can be pretty disabling. So bottom line is, we don't entirely understand it, but there's something going on where the virus dysregulates the whole immune system and your energy production system. So, for example, a recent study came out in Nature where they found that not only do people with long COVID have a hard time exercising, like our metabolism in an exercise test is much lower than other people's. We can't exercise as well. But then there's muscle damage from exercising, measurable muscle damage, and the metabolism gets even worse. And we think something like that is going on in the brain too. So if I overdo it, about 2 days later, I will crash and I will have severe neurological symptoms. I'll end up bedridden. I may end up with something that looks like a stomach virus. I won't get into the details. And so my whole life is now about managing my energy and pacing. And something as simple as an overloading sensory environment can actually make me crash too, because I think it's just too much work for my brain. Yeah. So like this, I tend to be able to do maybe one thing a day or one thing every 2 days. And so this is my special thing I'm doing today. And then I'll probably nap for 3 hours this afternoon to recover.
Well,
I have to do it every day.
I'm honored you chose this as one of your things. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
I do want to talk about your book, but let's talk a little bit about neurodiversity first, because I think it's important to understand what that is and what it actually means. Because I think I hear people say neurodiverse a lot, and I'm not sure I'm not sure they necessarily understand it. It's just sort of like, oh, I'm neurodiverse, or I have this neurodiverse issue, but not a full understanding of what that is and how it actually impacts them. So can you give me some background on neurodiversity? And actually, as you know, our position on it in general as a society has changed over time.
That's right. Before we were using the term neurodiverse, we were using the term neuroatypical. And I think that term's fine. I actually like it because I've always thought being atypical and unusual is interesting and fun.
Agreed.
But that I bring that up because that term was initially applied specifically to folks with autism. And then it started to be more broadly applied. So some folks in the autistic community will use neurodiverse specifically to mean autism. That is not how I use the term. I use it the way most developmentally focused doctors use it, which is to look at a broader range of situations in the brain that make you think very differently from the general public or the neurotypical brain, as we would say.
Okay. Like how so? Like, is it very individualized as to how it impacts you, or is it something where there are some general broad strokes?
There are definitely some general broad strokes, and I think there's a few main conditions that really qualify as neurodiverse, right? One is certainly autism, anywhere on the spectrum. The other is ADHD, and ADHD actually has some people have some features that overlap, like the autistic community and the ADHD community. And a lot of folks with autism have ADHD. So it's, that's an overlap.
No, there are a ton of similarities. And like with the sensory stuff and some of the rigidity and all of that, it's fascinating to me.
Also dyslexia. So folks with dyslexia have a different way of processing information. It's a lot more than just trouble with reading or trouble with writing. And in a second, I'll explain how those differences can show up, because there is some unifying stuff among neurodiversity. But one group people forget about is gifted intelligence. So technically, gifted intelligence is a group of neurodiversity, and many school districts consider it part of special education. And that's because gifted learners, it's not just IQ, the way they process information is different. It's not just faster, it's a different approach to the information than the neurotypical brain.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because it is technically special education, but they don't have the mandate to provide services that they would if you had a disability. And I find that a lot, the comorbidity with, I guess that's the right term, right? Is that the right term? Yes.
Comorbidity.
With a lot of my students, because they may have something like dyslexia. I have dyslexia, actually, dyslexia or ADHD that is impacting their education, but then they also have this gifted component. And unless they are challenged, we can't help them. You know what I'm saying? And so we have to incorporate the fact that they are so gifted along with the disability. But it's hard because, as I've learned recently, for children who are quite bright or gifted, they don't learn all the learning strategies, apparently, that the other kids are learning at the younger ages. And I didn't realize this, but it makes perfect sense. So that's why they have that performance cliff, you know, where it's either high school or college or somewhere where they stop performing, which I'm totally getting sidetracked with. But I find that really interesting because you said the special education piece. So a lot of kids, though, they get the diagnosis, yes, they're gifted, and that little IEP is written and put in a drawer, and no one deals with it later. But so I'm glad you brought it up. Sorry to
I don't
derail.
think that's I don't think that's a tangent at all. I think the 2E or the twice exceptional learning community it's a huge challenge, right?
Yeah.
And we don't even have a term for the kids I know who have ADHD plus gifted learning plus dyslexia. That's a thrice exceptional person, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
I mean, that's what SciC Start is all about. It's about individualizing the way we approach our kids. Instead of letting our culture tell us there's one way to do this, or there's a certain specific goal for a kid with dyslexia that you need to meet this goal, right? Well, no, maybe you don't. Maybe that's not right for that kid. Let's get to really know this child and how this kid works. You know,
or how to do it, right? So like if, as I think the example we were talking about before was, you know, that a child has to use a agenda book to get something done. Maybe that doesn't work for that child. Maybe the agenda book itself is the problem, not the completion of whatever the task is. So like making very rigid decisions on how a child's going to execute these goals and objectives can really hinder the child's progress.
So one example is one of my sons, you know, the agenda book was such a disaster, right? All those years where they were required to use it. And it became like a second task, right? Instead of it being a tool to help him complete tasks, it was a different task that was out of his approach, right? And then one day he showed me something he had come up with, because unfortunately my kids are all on Chromebooks at their school, and you know,
yes,
like
I'm
it's all
familiar with the concept.
And so, but what he's like, because I was just checking in with him, like, you know, do you have an approach? How are you keeping up with things? And he's like, Mom, this is what I do. I just have a Google Chrome document open, and I keep it open on my desktop all the time. And then in the class, when my teacher says an assignment, I just write it in there. And then when I've done it, I cross it up, I like delete it. And then that's how he does it. It's just it's really an agenda book, but he put it in line with his workflow in a way that worked for him. Right.
Right.
And that's an example of a kid figuring it out himself. But like, it's what we're talking about, you know, that it has to be what works for this kid with their workflow, you know?
Right. Yes. And I think we sometimes miss that part, the I in IEP, the individualized. And but we as a society tend to expect children to do things in a certain way. And if, as you said, if they're not doing it in that certain way, then we're going to teach them how to use it. Why are we adding a new task? Right? Like, why are we putting more on them, more on the parents, more on everyone? So I totally get that. So can you tell me a little bit about, or actually, you know what I want to talk about is we are talking about the societal pressures and expectations on parenting the neurodiverse. What do you see as some of those big barriers? I mean, we've talked a little bit about, you know, how expectations be a certain way. I would imagine it would be how you parent. What would be an example of something that a parent of a neurodiverse child might do that no one else would, or that someone else would think was weird?
Well, I think it starts...
Because that is what they'd say, that that's weird or wrong, right?
Right. And I think that starts very young. And for a lot of parents, especially if a child is somewhere in the spectrum of neurodiversity where it's There are some more severely affected people where we pick them up when they're 15, 18 months old, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people don't get diagnosed until well into grade school, for instance. So the classic age in my practice of ADHD diagnosis was first grade, when all of the sudden the work got more real, and then we were doing the workup on it, right? And so because of that, you have parents facing interesting behavioral challenges when the kids are really little without a diagnosis, without somebody saying, you're struggling with this because it's hard and your child has their own unique needs. Like, so one of the things that I find really unifies all the types of neurodiversity that I mentioned is sensory sensitivity. And with sensory sensitivity comes emotional sensitivity.
Yes.
In one example, and we really see this in all of them, but in ADHD, for instance, people think of it as attention dysregulation or difficulty regulating attention, but it's actually emotions too, right?
Yes.
But we see that same kind of intense emotional reactions in kids with autism and kids who are gifted and kids with dyslexia in many cases as well. And so what you've got is, so an example, right? Oh my gosh, this is one of my favorite families. And I'm allowed to share this story. It's actually in the book. But, her little guy would get overstimulated in the grocery store. And her partner was working, crazy shifts, and she didn't have somewhere he could be when she went grocery shopping. She needed to bring him to the grocery store. And he would have what initially she didn't know were neurodiverse meltdowns, as I like to call them, or sensory overstimulation meltdowns. And so he'd be basically tantruming in the grocery store, and she would get the looks. And I mean, this can happen to any parent with a young child, but it happens so much more often and almost predictably for parents of kids with sensory sensitivities, right? And so she just got in the habit of either, ignoring people and getting through, or leaving the cart and going out to the car. And sometimes she didn't even get to bring the groceries home, and other times she'd go back in and recollect them later. But, and I think it's incredibly hard if you're a parent that you don't know that this is what's happening. She fortunately had a clue because her spouse had ADHD. So she thought, well, maybe something's going on like what my spouse has with his ADHD. But I've worked with lots of parents who have no idea what's going on, and they feel like they are very bad parents. And they'll have people in public say to them, control your child, right?
That's astounding to me.
Or so often with neurodiverse kids, these things run genetically. And so one of the parents is neurodiverse or sensory sensitive. So now the parent is struggling with their own meltdown because the kid's melting down and overstimulating them. Right. And so sometimes parents can, maybe yell a little bit, and they didn't mean to, but that's the situation. And then they get the public censure, right? How could you be a terrible parent who yells at your kids, right?
I love that one. I do love that one, because I'm like, you're going to tell me you've never yelled at your kids. Then I don't think you have children. If you've never spoken inappropriately to them, I don't even know that that's a thing. But I do remember that. I mean, with the sensory overload, some of my kids have that as well. And there were just certain places. I remember showing up at the grocery store, and a friend of mine, I ran into them, and they're like, oh, you have the kids with you? I would never go to the grocery store without them. I'm like, if I never went to the grocery store without my children, we wouldn't eat, because I don't have somewhere else to put them. So sometimes it's not an option.
Right. And that's great advice if you have the privilege and the resources to have someone who can keep your kids, right?
Do your grocery shopping.
Or do your grocery shopping. But most of the population doesn't have that privilege, or those resources. And we just, we have to have compassion on each other,
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is lacking, because I think it's very easy to judge a parent right in that snippet. Like, I wouldn't do that, or my kid. And it's not true. I just don't believe that no parent has ever spoken out of line to their children or harshly or what have you. And I think we've all experienced it. But when we're in that moment, we're conditioned to figure out how we're better than somebody else, right? Like, I think that's just a thing in our brains, in our society. And there's no, how can I help? How is there something I can do or give them some space? That is sad to me. Although I will say I do struggle on airplanes when there's a kid screaming, even though I've had lots of kids on airplanes. I don't know why. That's something I struggle with. But I know it's not their fault. I know it's not their fault. And if you have a kid who's neurodiverse and you're now in that high pressure up in the air, talk about sensory overload.
Right. And so I think that's something you can see from both sides. I mean, I find it horrifying that airlines will actually kick people off the plane for a crying child.
Yeah, that's
but I
disgusting.
also find it's really hard on me if I have a kid near me on the plane who's screaming or who's kicking my seat, right? And so, but I know I get sensory overload. So I bring my really great noise canceling headphones and I do my breathing, and but oh God, when the kids are kicking, that is so hard.
That's actually worse than the crying. And the kicking is worse than the crying.
And that one's hard not to judge because when my kids were on a plane, we stopped them from kicking, right? We worked really hard to make sure they were not kicking the seat. So it is hard not to judge the parent behind you who is not stopping their child from kicking.
Right.
On the other hand, maybe that's how that kid stops screaming. So, you
got to think of it that this could be worse. How could this be worse? The kid could be screaming. Although I think the kicking's a little worse than the screaming, but maybe they know that if they reprimand them that they're going to get a meltdown. Well,
and I mean, to be honest, when I'm thinking back to times because here I'm being all judgy, right? But thinking back to times when we had kids on the plane, we stopped them from kicking, but then they made more noise, right? So it's
right. Well, the thing was for me was that I wasn't starting new rules or anything like that on a trip. Like if we were in confined areas or around long, groups of people, I was on a plane once, total side work, but we're on the plane and across the aisle was a little girl about the same age as my daughter. So probably 9 months, 6 or 9 months. And the child started screaming and the grandmother who was sitting there said, well, I'm going to give her pacifier. And the mother said, we're trying to break that habit right now, so I don't want to give it to her. And I reached across the aisle and I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, if you don't give her the pacifier, I will. And I was just this is not the time to try to break the habit of the pacifier, please.
Yeah, I hear that one.
So, I mean, I think it's more on the, if you don't feel like the parents are doing something, but I think that's where neurodivergent parents have a harder time because to us, we'll think, well, reprimanding them right now would make sense. Maybe for that neurodiverse child, it would escalate things, right? So
exactly.
It's
if
not
your child's
clear.
Starting to get overstimulated, the parent may know very well the signs of that. And a reprimand is going to be overstimulating and it's going to push them into meltdown, right? So that's the perception a lot of parents of neurodiverse children face is that they're permissive, that they're just letting the kid be spoiled and put up with anything. Well, no, they're managing a different type of nervous system. And, there's a time and a place to do the learning, but it's not when the kid's overheated,
Right. That's not the moment to dive in and add more to the pile. So let's talk a little bit about PSI-C START. What is it? How did that come to be?
So basically, amidst all of this, number one, there's a general culture of anxiety in parenting. And with neurodiverse families, I think it's just so much more heightened because our culture, tells parents what they should and should not do, that if they don't do this, they're going to mess up their kids for life. You should do this, you should do that, you should never do that other thing. And so I call that the should storm. Because it's a storm of this shoulds, of this pressure that's really overstimulating and anxiety producing for all parents. And it gives these impossible and often conflicting goals for what you should be achieving with your kids. And then how much more so for neurodiverse families, where now the standards for those families can be even harder to meet, both in general and sometimes in the neurodiverse community. You've got parents jumping in with, well, you should do this therapy, you should do that, you should try this, you should try that.
Yes.
Right. And in an effort to help, but it's overwhelming. And so that drives a lot of parenting anxiety. Then I was looking for a book to really help parents, in that. And I found some really lousy parenting advice out there, and I found some really good stuff. But a lot of the good stuff was too complicated for me. Like if I couldn't remember it in the moment with my kids, then, in my busy life, then it wasn't working for me, right?
Right.
I didn't have an hour to sit down and apply the 5 steps that I read in that really great book, right? So eventually I realized I'm not going to find what I'm looking for. I need to develop something. And that's where See Start came from. So, we were taught that if your clothes light on fire, you're supposed to stop, drop, and roll.
Yes.
And we all remember that. That's easy to remember. We all remember that.
Right? Stop, drop, and roll. Yeah.
So when your nervous system's on fire as a parent, or when you feel a should, or you feel unsure, or you feel anxious, you sigh, see, and start. And I love this method because it's just like we talked about before. It's got to be in line with your workflow, right?
Right.
This is, as a parenting method, that's it. You're staying right in the middle of where you are, but you're using this method, and it can be used in 10 seconds or 2 seconds, or it can be used in a more deliberate way, to think about your kids and plan as a parent other times.
I love that because it's telling the parent directly what to do. When you're in those situations and you're like, which one of the 10,000 strategies do I apply to this moment? And how many steps does it have? That's a lot to try and figure out. So I love that, you're taking a breath, you're slowing down, you're slowing yourself down, right? By taking a sigh, and then take the time to observe the situation, because sometimes it's not always exactly as we see it.
No.
Not that first glimmer, you don't realize what's going on. So to take a moment and see it and really observe what's happening and what your child's emotional state is, and then start responding. And so how do you respond then?
So I love the way you kind of described that there, because you gave 2 examples, right? One is the way we normally approach it. We run through our head and we say, which should I apply here, right? Which should, and then we jump right into trying to fix it, right?
Action.
And what we're not, so who are we responding to then? We're responding to the should storm. We are not, or we're reacting to the should storm. We're not responding to our kids, right? And so with See Start, it's a lot of people see sigh as, it's like a pause, right? Like I've heard that in other, but it's not. It's more than that, because sigh is a quick neurological breathing technique to calm your nervous system. So it actually helps with the overstimulation. Okay. When we get overstimulated, we go into the fight or flight response, or anxiety, right?
Right.
And when we're in fight or flight, we actually shut down the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that helps us make wise decisions. And
not a part you want to shut down.
Not a part you want to shut down as a parent, right? And so sigh, the long, slow out breath, stimulates the vagus nerve. It tells our nervous system you are safe. It is okay to calm down and connect. And that actually helps turn back on that part of our brain that makes wise decisions, the critical thinking part. Now, when I'm really overwrought, I find that I need to sigh 3 times in a row. Like, no, just once isn't enough. But what I love about sigh as well is that parents tell me, oh, I get that, doc. Like, I sigh at my kids all the time anyway, right?
Right.
So it's already in our workflow.
Right. I agree with you. I do the 3 to calm myself down. Sometimes it's just when I'm in the middle of Target by myself because it's so stimulating, but to take those breaths really, really do actually calm you down if you do it right. So I love that that's part of it.
I mean, let's do it with our listeners right now. Like, and just feel like you can feel your heart rate going down, your shoulders relaxing, and it feels good, And what I love is it brings you back into your own body as well. And that's important too, because what our kids need most from us is not selecting the right should.
Right.
It's our presence.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, a lot of times when our kids act up, it's because they're trying to get our presence. They're trying to get our full attention. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we give them with C. Then we give them the full attention. C is a very momentary mindfulness method. So you don't have to meditate for 30 minutes. You just see what's going on. And I do not mean C necessarily vision for our visually impaired folks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean noticing. I mean observing. I just picked the word because, 3 S's is easier to remember, right?
Yeah.
But noticing without doing, noticing without immediately deciding what needs to change, just noticing. That's what mindfulness is. It's noticing a situation with acceptance. So you just accept, yeah, this is the way things are right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, and only then, do you start. And then with start, what you're going to do is you're going to process the information you've gathered, right? Start thinking about what might be an appropriate response to what I just noticed, right? Maybe you're going to use some of that good parenting advice you found, but you're going to hopefully apply it more wisely and more appropriately. One of my favorite ways to start is to do nothing, especially when we're talking about moments where everybody's overheated. Sometimes what my kids from me is quiet, because I am prone to the too much talking mistake where I overstimulate my children by talking too much. So,
oh, yeah, that's my jam.
Oh, yeah. And it's very common. The latest parenting methods really emphasize over talking and over explaining. And that's highly irritating to a child who's heated up. Right. And what I love about START is it's not just about number one, this method helps you with any other technique you're using. So let's say you got some great ideas from your OT to work with your child, right? Your occupational therapist. Well, you're going to apply those better if you use PSI, C, and START as you apply them. The other thing is, this is where it's really different from other parenting methods, because with START, we're running an experiment.
Right.
So instead of following our society's pressure to get it exactly right the first time, because we're supposed to know, right?
Exactly. We're pros from the beginning, right? It's intuitive.
And somehow it's very unclear of what exactly right is, but we're going to get it right, right?
We're going to get it right. Yep. Regardless.
Instead, we're going to start learning together with our kid, right? So I might start something and that something might work. It might work in that situation. That's great. I'm going to file that away as something I've learned, right? That builds my sense of skills, builds my sense of confidence in my abilities as a parent. That's fantastic. Maybe I start something and it doesn't work. Maybe it backfires horrendously, right?
Yes, I've experienced that.
Oh, yeah. Especially, again, in the neurodiverse community, because we're more prone to having these meltdowns, right? So if it backfires, my response is typically, my natural response has been, oh, I should have done it differently. Oh, I'm a lousy parent, right? I'm a failure. Well, hold on. We know what we do when we feel a should, right? We sigh, see, and start again. And so I've noticed it in myself with years of practicing this, and I've heard it from parent after parent who's tried the method, that it completely changes your attitude toward your own parenting and toward mistakes. So mistakes are no longer a crisis.
Yeah.
They're part of learning. Everything I try as a parent, everything I start is a learning opportunity.
Right.
And if it doesn't work, I just sigh, see, and start again. Don't miss the sigh and see. Don't jump right to start, And
No. It's great, because I think, like you said, that it's a pause. And if you can pause and breathe and observe, you're going to be in such a better place to respond. Even if that response is still anger or whatever it is, it's going to be so much more productive anger, and it's going to be better thought through.
That's right.
I can't tell you the number of things that have just popped out of my mouth that really shouldn't have, because I wasn't able to take that pause.
That's right. And usually those things are things we heard growing up, or, something that's coming from that should storm culture. And they're often not helpful or even, so yeah, it helps us avoid that. But I think what's also cool is, as we change our attitude toward ourselves and we shift away from perfectionism toward a really positive, hey, I'm learning, I'm trying things and I'm learning. What kind of space does that give our kids? Right? suddenly, if we're giving our self space to grow in a natural way, in a deliberate but gentle way toward ourselves, well, we're giving that space to our kids. And what's one of the number one things neurodiverse kids feel? They feel like they're messing up all the time.
Yeah, they're not doing anything right ever. They have people telling them they're not doing anything right all the time.
Right. And, you might think gifted learners is an exception, but that's not the case.
No.
They also, even if they're getting success and positive feedback in schoolwork, maybe there are other areas of their life where they are feeling like they're always out of sync, or they're never getting it right, or they're never quite like other people. So yeah, it really affects everybody. And if it's not about getting it right, it's about seeing what works and learning together. I mean, that's just a totally different dynamic. And parents tell me that with practice, it transforms their home. And I never expected to hear something so amazing like that. Like, it's transformed my home, right? I just hope to help parents a little. But to hear that it's helping that much, I mean, that's really, it's something I hope that can reach other families and help them too,
Yeah. And I can absolutely see that. And, I have several neurodiverse children, some more than others. And taking that pause for me, I didn't know PSYC start at the time, but being able to take that time to take a breath and observe the situation before I jumped in is game changing, no matter how it is that I'm going to jump in. And I could see that that's game changing. And so it's a matter of remembering it. And when you talk about the talking to death with kids, which I do to my kids all the time, but my son, I heard him once say, he's like, yeah, when she's yelling, it's fine. If she goes silent, get worried.
Oh, I love that.
It's like, oh, that's good to know.
But the other thing I wanted to point out, if you don't mind, is just you mentioned the pause. And I think that's really important when we have time, but we don't always have time to pause, right? What if your child's neurodiverse meltdowns include possible physical harm, right? Some kids bang their heads. Some kids, can be really wild with their bodies in an unsafe way. And one of the ways our nervous system responds to too much overstimulation or a feeling of threat, it might be fight or flight, but sometimes it's freeze. And I've experienced both as a parent. And what I think is cool about PSYC Start is, especially once you've been doing it for a while, it becomes second nature. So you don't even necessarily think the steps out loud anymore. They just happen. It becomes a mindset. And that's great in freeze moments. Like that moment where I will freeze because my kid's doing something dangerous. PSYC Start, grab him and pull him away from there, pull him a hook. My little one, oh my gosh, he used to really make every possible effort to run in front of cars in the parking lot at all times.
Love that.
There were years like that, right? And so, just being able to quickly mobilize out of that freeze response, and grab my child has also been a helpful part of that tool, right? So it's good for crisis management too.
No, that is a very good point, because you don't always have the time to completely calm yourself down. But I hear what you're saying with that as a methodology, and it's just sort of second nature to you. You can respond better. I think under any circumstances, even if it has to be very, very quick.
And not perfectly. Sometimes you still mess it up, and that's okay, right?
Right. I heard somebody speaking who was an author of a different parenting book, and they said that when they had an argument with their child, they found their child in the room writing liar all over her book. And ripping pages. And I thought that was the best example. She's like, so we don't always get it right just because we wrote it.
That's awesome.
Really funny. Yeah. So we're talking a lot about neurodiversity, but what about sometimes the behaviors are just a symptom of something bigger happening?
Yeah.
And what I hear a lot from the classroom, from the teacher, is I know they have this issue, but they're doing that on purpose, or I know that, they don't have a challenge with that. You think they do, but I know they're smart enough to know a difference. And so how do you distinguish? And I don't believe they're bad kids. I just don't. I think the kids might be responding poorly to a bad situation, but I don't think kids are innately bad. That's not what they're natural pleasers. I mean, there might be sociopathic things out there that are different, but as a rule, children are different. Oh, what would I say wrong?
Even sociopaths, the
Mhm.
science shows that raised with compassion and appropriate expectations, most sociopaths are productive members of society. They just don't have a lot of empathy.
Interesting.
So, no, as a pediatrician, I do not believe there are bad children. I can't. I've known
Yeah.
too many of them. I meet them when they're babies.
I
They're all
know.
just, they've all just
I
got those
know.
little souls looking out of their eyes and like, no.
I know.
So,
But when is it not neurodiversity, I guess, is what I'm kind of getting at. And how do you distinguish between, because it is true. Sometimes, I have a child who has selective hearing, depending
Right.
on who the teacher was, right? And it was just because he didn't like her. And it was not part of his disability or anything else. He just didn't like this teacher. And so, distinguishing that from
Right.
something else, how do we do that? Because you'd approach it differently, I presume.
I would say I would reframe that. And I would suggest that might, it's funny, I've been watching the latest season of True Detective. And on the show, the detective, she keeps saying, wrong question, ask the right question, right? So for me, the question here is not, is that, what part of my kid is that from? It's, how can I help my child achieve this expectation?
Interesting.
And I see your point, because sometimes when it's related to disability, we are going to reassess the expectation and change the expectation, right? I get that.
Yes.
But much of the time, it's what's going wrong that my child is not meeting this expectation. And maybe it's your child decided that that's just not an expectation they feel is important and they're not going to value it, which, by the way, is a classically neurodiverse thing to say, right? Because neurodiverse kids tend to question the rules in a way that neurotypical kids do less. So that's actually part of neurodiversity, to say, well, no, I think this is an irrelevant way to do this, Mom. Like, I think the teacher's stupid to do it that way, and I'm not going to do it, right? Like,
Right, right. I know a better way.
Or if we get curious, and that's again what the Psi and C part is about. It's about getting curious. What am I seeing, right? A lot of times start is asking, especially if your child's old enough where you can have a conversation about it. Because, with younger kids, sometimes you can get some information and sometimes you can't. But, hey, buddy, I noticed this, or I heard about this, like, hey, what's going on with that? And there's a whole chapter in the book that addresses working on our approach so that our kids actually trust us enough to give us the information.
Yeah.
Because we have to really prove to them that we are actually genuinely interested. We're not immediately going to tell them how they need to be different.
Right.
Or criticize them. Right. And so, okay. And I have found with my own kids that the answers are often very surprising. But yeah, I've had that with my own kids. I mean, and the other one that is a very common one we hear from teachers is, well, they do it 70% or they do it 80% of the time. They're not doing this other times. They just need to do it because they can. We know they can. Well, no.
I love that one because I know they can.
No. And that's a classic feature of ADHD. And in my opinion, I think it's definitely true in autism as well. Just because they can do it sometimes doesn't mean they can do it all the time, right?
Well, my response to that is always, well, I'm thrilled to hear that so-and-so is able to keep it together during art.
Right.
Or recess. That's wonderful.
Right.
We've got 2 places now that student is able to keep it together. What are we going to do so that they can keep it together during the rest of them?
Think about someone like with a physical disability, right? Like they may be able to, let's say there's something with their legs and they use an assistive device to walk, right? But it's really exhausting for them, right?
Yeah.
So they may be able to do it for a certain amount of time, but at a certain point, their body is too tired and they just can't keep doing it. They need to rest. And neurodiverse kids, in part just because of the sensory overload that normal life brings on a daily basis, they get tired often sooner than their peers. They say that folks with sensory sensitivities are processing about 5 times the amount of information at any one time compared to the typical brain. And that's exhausting, right?
It is. It's absolutely exhausting if your brain doesn't shut off, if you're not able to separate out every single noise. And, that's why some kids are able to keep it together all day at school and they come home and they completely fall apart. They just fall apart. And the school says, well, we don't see that here. I'll say, but you're going to, because if they're falling apart when they step off the bus, at some point that's going to start creeping into the school day, and then we're going to have a bigger problem. So how do we address this so that school isn't so painful? Because a lot of times what that turns into is school avoidance.
Yes. And think about the poor parents, what we're dealing with at home, right?
I know. I know. It's excruciating.
Yeah. It's a lot.
So this has been so unbelievably helpful. I've really loved this conversation because I think it's so critical to better understand neurodiversity and what it actually means, because as we discussed, sometimes it can just look like a temper tantrum or look like the parent isn't doing something that they should be doing. Should be, see, there's a should. And, to try and take that away in a society that is really obsessed with the shoulds, like really obsessed with it. I think and what's hard for parents is it's not always easy to stand up and be like, that's tough. That's how I parent, right? It's not easy. It's easy to feel less than and feel judged. And that's exhausting too. And as you said, also neurodiversity, it's often genetic, right? It's likely that a parent may be struggling with the same issues at the same time. And it's a perfect storm. So I think this has been really great. And I love SciC comes out at the end of the month. Is that when
it's on sale February 20th, but it's already available wherever books are sold. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Because I was looking on Amazon and it said February 20th. So, but excellent. So you can pre-order. Awesome. I'm definitely going to pre-order this. It sounds amazing. And I love how you say it works with other strategies. So it's not telling you can't implement whatever it is that you agree with or whatever philosophy you like. It's just giving you a mechanism through which to start, right?
That's right. So this is a philosophy and it is a mindset, because there is a philosophy of positivity here, right? I believe in parents' abilities. I believe in kids' abilities. I think we know more about what we need than we think, which is part of what the philosophy is. Yes. But I had no intention of writing a book with that attitude we sometimes see, which is, this is the only way to parent and every other way is wrong and you need to do it this way. Or you need to share my specific set of cultural or religious values or whatever. Like, I have great respect, and I've been fortunate to care for a culturally and internationally diverse group of families. And, every culture and tradition has something to offer. So this is meant to be a very respectful approach that doesn't say it has to be precisely this way or it has to be that. But within that, we really want to approach our kids with respect. We do want to move away from the shaming of our culture and the shaming that we may have grown up with that isn't helpful for our kids or ourselves, right?
Right. If we didn't like it, why are we doing it?
Yeah, it didn't feel good. It didn't help me learn. It usually made me shut down.
Right. Exactly. So why are we doing it now? I always love that when people say, well, that's what my parents did. It's like, yeah, but you didn't like it. So doesn't make it correct. I love the concept that it's a place to start, and it's about regulating you as well. It's not just about the child, it's about regulating yourself so that you're prepared to handle the child, right? To make that decision on what to do next. Yes. And so I'm very excited to read this. Is there anything we missed? I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
I mean, I feel like you and I could have
I could keep talking to you for like another. I was just thinking that I'm like in my head coming up with other topics to get you back to discuss.
Oh, the gifts that come with neurodiversity is one of my favorite subjects. Like,
let's talk about that someday.
But that's it for another time for sure.
That's another. Oh, that'll be a good one though. I like that. See, thank you. And also maybe long COVID.
Sure. Yeah.
Would that be because there's a lot to it, right?
I'd love to come back and talk about either of those things. People have no idea how many highly successful people I know who are neurodiverse. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, we hear that and everyone's like, ooh, they're neurodiverse too. And I was like, I think we might be in the majority here. I'm not really sure it's a minority, but okay. Well, Alison, thank you so much for joining me. And if anyone says like, well, first of all, you can find the book on Amazon, as you can find almost any book, but anywhere that you buy books, you can get it, right? Psi-C Start. By Dr. Escalante. And is there another website? Is there somewhere you want me to direct people to? If someone's saying, I need to find this woman.
Sure. Well, there's also a free chapter to read available as well.
Oh, great.
And the website is psicstart.com.
Okay, great. So go to psicstart.com if you want to learn a little bit more.
Yeah.
And the book's available.
Yeah.
And I think you'll definitely be back. So I'm excited.
I would love that. I would love
Awesome.
that. I
Well,
love
thank you.
the neurodiverse community. I love it.
It's perfect. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.